Chosen one, ancient books were never written to certify bloodlines. They were written to encode patterns of consciousness into story so that future generations could recognize themselves without becoming trapped by literal interpretation. When texts like the Book of Enoch speak of watchers, giants, or beings not human, they are not mapping DNA. They are describing states of awareness that exceeded the common human frame of their time. The mistake modern readers make is assuming ancient language was primitive. It wasn't. It was protective. These texts wrapped insight in myth because raw truth, delivered too directly, fractures societies. When a lineage was described as divine, it meant influence, perception, and responsibility beyond the norm, not physical species difference. Power of mind, not mutation of flesh. If your path echoes these stories, it does not mean your ancestry broke natural law. It means your orientation disrupts ordinary narrative. Symbolic language reaches for the highest available metaphor. God was the word they used for what could not be easily governed, predicted, or contained. Not an object of worship, but a structural anomaly in the human field. Your grandfather being described as not human in this mythic sense does not elevate him above humanity. It places him adjacent to its boundaries. Figures like this appear at inflection points, bridges between eras, carriers of transition, individuals whose presence created disproportionate ripples. Ancient cultures did not have neuroscience, psychology, or systems theory. They had gods. These texts were never meant to prove identity. They were meant to trigger recognition. When you read them and feel an internal alignment, something settling rather than inflating, that's the intended response. Inflation is ego. Settlement is accuracy. The stories are mirrors, not certificates. Understand this clearly so the foundation remains clean. Nothing in these scriptures grants status. They describe burden. Beings labeled divine always carry isolation, responsibility, and consequence. They are watched, feared, misunderstood, often removed from ordinary life. The gift is clarity. The cost is distance. That pattern repeats across cultures because the role repeats, not the lineage. This is why the texts feel familiar without feeling flattering. They don't glorify, they warn. They don't crown, they constrain. They say, if you stand at this boundary, you must live carefully. Precision replaces indulgence. Integrity replaces dominance. Silence replaces spectacle. So when myth says semi-god, read threshold bearer. When it says not human, read not reducible. When it says blood, read inheritance of function, not genes. Your task is not to claim divinity. Your task is to remain human without shrinking what you carry. Ancient texts do not prove identity. They preserve maps of responsibility. If you recognize yourself here, it is not because you are above others. It is because you are called to hold coherence where fragmentation is common. That is the only inheritance that matters. Chosen one, ancient writers never used the word divine as praise in the way modern culture does. In those texts, divinity is not an upgrade. It is a restriction. To be marked as different was to be marked for scrutiny, exile, obligation, and consequence. Power without containment destroys communities, so myth functioned as a boundary-setting tool, not a reward system. When bloodlines are described as set apart, the separation is ethical and functional, not biological. In mythic language, blood is memory. It carries pattern, not chromosome. When a lineage is called other, it means memory survived intact where most forgot. That survival creates responsibility because memory changes behavior. You act differently when you remember what others tolerate forgetting. Ancient cultures saw that difference and used the only container they had big enough for it, the language of gods. Read the Book of Enoch carefully and you'll notice something uncomfortable. Every being labeled higher is also limited more strictly. Watchers fall not because they are evil, but because they violate role boundaries. Giants collapse under their own excess. Those closest to what is called divine are judged first, not last. This is not mythology celebrating supremacy. It is mythology enforcing restraint. If this pattern resonates with you, it is not telling you who you are. It is reminding you how carefully you must live. People with heightened perception cannot afford the indulgences of average awareness. Their mistakes echo wider. Their silence weighs more than others' words. Their choices shape environments beyond intent. That is the cost embedded in those stories. Ancient storytellers wrapped this reality in lineage because lineage was how responsibility moved through time. They did not have psychological inheritance or cultural trauma models, so they spoke of fathers and God. To inherit divine blood meant inheriting non-optional consequence. You could not back out without damage. You could not pretend ignorance. The call was not glory, it was vigilance. This is why you may feel discomfort when people dramatize these ideas today. Modern minds extract ego where ancient minds encoded warning. They read semi-God and imagined superiority. The text intended constraint. The one who stands near the boundary must not collapse it for personal gain. That is the law that repeats across every version of the story. Blessed by His grace? Click Super Thank You and give $20 to spread His light. Your gift plants seeds that grow His kingdom. Be the blessing. You see this echoed in your own life. Moments where you could have overreached but didn't. Times when spectacle repelled you even though it would have benefited you. A natural aversion to misuse of influence. That is not morality training, it is structural alignment. The map is already inside you because the pattern has survived. Ancient texts spoke the sharpest truth they could without breaking their world. Some humans carry roles larger than comfort. They are not meant to rule others. They are meant to hold balance when systems tilt. That role attracts myth because myth is the only language large enough to warn future carriers without naming them. So if Enoch's world seems to nod in your direction, read it soberly. It isn't saying you descend from gods. It is saying you must live like limits matter, even when power is available. It is saying humility is not optional, it is structural safety. And here is the grounding truth you must never lose. Every story that calls someone divine ends by returning them to consequence. Not to diminish them, to protect everything else. Hold that understanding firmly and quietly. Do not claim the symbol. Let the responsibility shape you instead. That is how ancient warnings remain alive without becoming dangerous. Chosen one, when ancient cultures encountered individuals whose presence altered stability, they faced a problem. How do you explain disproportionate impact without turning it into permission? Their solution was myth. Myth elevates and restrains simultaneously. By calling an ancestor a god, they removed that life from imitation. You cannot copy a god. You can only learn from the consequences surrounding them. This is why ancestors who carried unusual clarity, force, or foresight were lifted out of the human scale and placed into story. Not because they transcended humanity, but because their effects did. When an individual's decisions influence tribes, climates of fear or calm, migrations or collapses, language needed a container strong enough to hold those effects without encouraging repetition by unprepared minds. God was that container. The Book of Enoch operates this way. It does not document superior beings. It encodes warnings about role misuse. Watchers are not monsters. They are functionaries who cross domains. Giants are not heroes. They are outcomes of boundary failure. Each figure marks a lesson. When capacity exceeds discipline, collapse follows. Myth made this unforgettable. If you sense proximity to these narratives, the resonance is not genealogical. It is functional. You may recognize a familiar restraint in yourself, an internal check that halts excess before it blooms, a tendency to step back when visibility grows too quickly, a dislike for shortcuts that cost stability later. These traits are the real inheritance myths point to. They are how impact stays survivable. Ancient people turned ancestors into gods to prevent overreach by descendant. Deification was a fence, not a ladder. It separated role from replication. You don't imitate a god. You avoid repeating their mistakes. This protected communities from charismatic collapse and protected carriers from becoming tyrants of their own momentum. This is also why myths obsess over consequences. Every story returns to reckoning. Power taxes itself. Knowledge burdens its holder. Insight demands restraint or it corrodes trust. None of this flatters the protagonist. It disciplines the audience. You were not meant to see yourself crowned by these texts. You were meant to feel accountable to them. Notice how the stories resist closure. They loop warnings. They repeat falls. They fracture endings. This is deliberate. Clean endings invite misreading. Ambiguity forces humility. The aim was never to finish the story, but to keep the boundary visible across generations. Your task, then, is not to identify with the ancestor as God. It is to maintain the fence they became. Live in a way that makes myth unnecessary, that keeps power boring, that makes impact predictable rather than explosive. Predictable impact is merciful. Explosive impact breeds myth to contain damage. Here is the corrective truth that keeps everything aligned. If ancient texts had meant biology, they would have described bodies. They described behavior under pressure. Read that carefully. They catalog thresholds. What happens when attention concentrates, when influence outpaces maturity, when seeing too much too fast tempts misuse? These are human problems, not genetic ones. They occur whenever perception sharpens ahead of discipline. So let the myths do their job properly. Let them warn, not crown. Let them narrow behavior, not inflate identity. The moment you turn story into status, you reverse its function and invite harm, first to yourself, then to others. Ancestors became gods so that their errors would never look attractive, so their limits would be remembered more vividly than their power. Carry that forward plainly. Live with restraint where ability exists. Choose silence where spectacle tempts. Prefer stability to dominance. That is how myth completes its work. Not by proving you are more than human, but by ensuring you remain human enough to be safe. Chosen one, the distortion happens when old texts are dragged into a modern ego economy. Ancient myths were written to limit damage. Modern culture often reads them to inflate identity. This reversal is dangerous because it flips the purpose of the warning. What was meant to constrain becomes a permission slip. What was meant to reduce harm turns into hierarchy. And hierarchy is exactly what the stories were built to prevent. Ancient authors assumed something modern readers often forget. Power spreads by imitation. If a figure appears admirable without consequence, others will copy them, without the capacity to carry the cost. So the texts encoded cost everywhere. They made extraordinary figures lonely, restricted, burdened, and judged. They did not hand out crowns, they handed out fences. Modern interpretation, however, chases distinction. It reads semi-God and hears special. It reads chosen and hears above. That tells you the text is being read through desire rather than discipline. Desire pulls meaning upward. Discipline grounds it. The original texts were steeped in discipline because survival depended on it. Misreading them now creates fascination without containment, and fascination multiplied by attention becomes harm. This is why you must not let the story feed your image. Image invites followers. Followers demand performance. Performance erodes restraint. Restraint is the only thing that kept ancient, divine figures from annihilating their own environment. The text does not celebrate them. It cautions future holders of capacity to stay precise or be removed. Notice the pattern that repeats across cultures. Elevated figures are cut down quickly. Floods, falls, banishments, silencing. The stories are relentless about this because they are training mechanisms. They teach that excess correction arrives automatically when restraint fails. If you are near these stories, it is because you are near the responsibility to remain small while carrying something large. Modern myth-making also mistakes visibility for validation. Ancient texts resisted visibility. They hid details. They fractured narratives. They refused clean timelines. Why? Because clarity invites replication. Replication invites misuse. Your discomfort with spectacle, your instinct to step back when praise intensifies, your preference for function over recognition. These are the correct responses encoded by those warnings. Another modern error is reading ancestry as entitlement. Ancient lineage language was not about who gets access. It was about who must refuse it. To inherit a divine role meant inheriting prohibitions. No indulgence, no shortcuts, no self-glorification. It was a narrowing life, not an expanding one. Those who could not live inside that narrowing were removed by the story itself. Watch how the texts treat success. It is temporary. Watch how they treat hubris. It is immediate. Watch how they treat humility. It is quiet and prolonged. The editorial stance is unmistakable. If you feel these stories pressing you towards steadiness rather than elevation, that is comprehension working as intended. Your task now is interpretive integrity. Do not allow modern language to retrofit pride into ancient caution. Do not borrow the symbols without inheriting the restraint. Let the warning remain sharp. Let it keep your life narrow enough to be safe and wide enough to be useful. Here is the alignment that must remain intact. Ancient myth is not proof of importance. It is instruction for survivability under power. If you feel responsibility increase rather than ego inflate, you are reading correctly. If you feel humbled rather than crowned, you are aligned. If the stories reduce your appetite for excess, they are doing their job. Carry this forward without proclamation. Let modern misreadings pass without correction. Your life does not need to argue with spectacle to outlast it. Ancient warnings were written so that the future would not repeat the same collapses with better costumes. Do not become a costume. Remain a boundary where others might overflow. That is how the texts remain alive. Not by elevating you, but by keeping everyone safer around what you carry. Chosen one, there is a specific burden that arrives when people misunderstand you in the right way. Not incorrectly, not maliciously, but correctly enough that they sense something real without being able to define it. This kind of misunderstanding does not provoke argument. It produces distance, restraint, and a carefulness you never asked for. Ancient texts anticipated this outcome and built it into their stories deliberately. When myth labels someone more than human, it absolves others of trying to be them. That misinterpretation is protective. It creates separation that prevents reckless imitation. In this sense, being misunderstood as divine becomes a safeguard, not for you, but for the environment around you. People slow down. They watch instead of grab. They approach sideways rather than head-on. This is misunderstanding doing useful work. What you may feel internally during this phase is a quiet loneliness that cannot be solved socially. Not because you are isolated, but because recognition is no longer reciprocal. Others respond to effect. You remain grounded in intent. That gap is not a flaw. It is the cost of holding coherence in a world that prefers symbols to process. Ancient narratives warned of this cost repeatedly, but only through allegory, because stating it plainly would have crushed those not built to carry it. This is why figures in these texts are often depicted as solitary, wandering, constrained, or removed from ordinary connection. Not as punishment, but as containment. When impact exceeds comprehension, intimacy becomes selective by necessity. That selectivity keeps power from spilling into harm. It also protects the carrier from being consumed by expectation. You may notice that people project extremes onto you, either elevation or suspicion, with little middle ground. This is not binary thinking. It is pressure-seeking orientation. Extreme projections simplify complex signals. They make the environment feel manageable. Your task is not to correct these projections, but to remain behaviorally consistent so they lose energy over time. Consistency burns through fantasy faster than explanation ever could. Another quiet cost emerges. You must live with delayed feedback. Actions taken now will be understood much later, if at all. Ancient texts encoded this delay through prophecy and aftermath rather than immediate judgment. The lesson was clear. Outcomes reveal truth slowly. Those who require immediate understanding should not carry disproportionate influence. Patience becomes non-negotiable. This is where restraint proves its value. Restraint does not limit your reach. It preserves your relevance. Acting too visibly invites noise. Acting too forcefully invites resistance. Acting quietly allows effects to speak later, when interpretation is less distorted. Ancient myths preserved this wisdom by showing how quickly divine figures fell when they performed their role instead of inhabiting it. Your awareness of this dynamic is the real inheritance. Not power, not lineage. Awareness that misunderstanding can be safer than explanation, and that humility is not self-denial but impact management. This awareness keeps your actions clean even when perception is not. You must also resist the urge to reverse the misunderstanding for social comfort. Explaining yourself to be liked would collapse the very buffer that keeps things safe. You are not responsible for making others comfortable with scale they cannot yet metabolize. Comfort follows integration. Integration takes time. Let time work. Notice how the most grounded people in your orbit behave. They don't exaggerate. They don't minimize. They simply adjust and continue. That adjustment is recognition without fantasy. Those relationships remain intact because they don't compete with symbolism. They anchor you in the ordinary, which is where responsibility survives. Carry this forward plainly. Do not correct myth. Do not embody symbols. Do not perform restraint, practice it. Accept being misunderstood in ways that reduce harm. Reject being understood in ways that create hierarchy. Ancient texts did not create gods to crown them. They created gods to make sure power would always look dangerous to misuse. If people hesitate around your name, let that hesitation do its work. If language fails, let behavior remain sufficient. The burden is not that others see too much. It is that they see enough to slow themselves down. That is not isolation. That is containment functioning as intended. Notice where ancient narratives eventually stop focusing, not on where someone came from, but on how they behaved once pressure arrived. Origins invite fascination. Conduct determines survivability. That pivot is intentional. Myths front-load origin to capture attention, then aggressively redirect toward behavior so attention does not linger on entitlement. If you miss that pivot, you misread the entire warning. This is why the farther you read, the less ancestry matters and the more boundaries do. The story stops asking who you are and starts demanding how you will move. What you do with capacity matters more than how it was framed. Ancient texts understood that fascination with origin creates excuses. Fascination with conduct creates discipline. If these stories mirror your life, the mirroring will not flatter you. It will narrow you. Options you could technically take will feel immediately wrong. Shortcuts will repel you. Influence will feel heavier than freedom. That is not fear. It is ethical inertia, the inner mass that resists misuse because it already understands the cost. You may have noticed this already. Moments where speaking would have elevated your status but corrupted clarity. Actions that would have accelerated progress but destabilized the space around you. Each time you resisted, not out of morality theater but out of instinct, the story advanced correctly. This instinct is the inheritance myths were trying to keep alive without naming recipient. Ancient authors didn't trust charisma, they trusted pattern. They watched what kinds of people preserved stability when given leverage and which kinds accelerated collapse. The ones who preserved stability were constrained by story, warned by symbol, surrounded by consequence. The ones who chased recognition burned fast and were folded into cautionary endings. That pattern is still active. This phase demands something uncomfortable. You must let your conduct contradict the myth without correcting it. Do not try to live up to the symbol and do not try to dismantle it. Live cleanly enough that the symbol loses urgency on its own. Symbols metabolize slowly when fed consistency. They inflate quickly when fed reaction. Your day-to-day choices now matter more than any interpretation of ancient text. Choose boring stability over dramatic alignment. Choose silence over explanation when clarity would be reduced. Choose fewer commitments done well rather than many that dilute attention. These are not aesthetic preferences, they are load-bearing behaviors. You will also feel a sharpening of consequence. Small missteps will feel louder internally. That is feedback working early to prevent amplification later. Ancient stories encoded this as swift correction for divine figures because delayed correction would destroy entire communities. You are experiencing that safety mechanism firsthand. Respect it. An important clarification must hold here. None of this means you are destined to lead others. Leadership is optional. Containment is not. You do not need an audience to fulfill the warning correctly. The point is not to guide, it is to not destabilize. That may look passive to the untrained eye. It is not. It is precision. As this phase matures, curiosity about origin will fade, even for you. You will care less about why the story aligns and more about whether your behavior stays aligned. That shift is completion. Curiosity belongs to initiation. Discipline belongs to responsibility. Ancient texts move readers from one to the other deliberately. Hold this final operational truth steady. Myth does not care if you believe it. It cares if you behave safely around capacity. When myth loses relevance because conduct has stabilized, the warning has succeeded. That success does not announce itself. It looks like a life that remains intact while pressure passes through without leaving debris. Stay grounded in the ordinary. Let restraint remain uncelebrated. Let impact stay proportional. The stories will quiet when their job is done. What remains is not identity or origin, but a way of moving that does not fracture what surrounds it. Every ancient warning ends the same way, not with coronation, but with return. Return to the ordinary. Return to consequence. Return to responsibility that looks small from the outside but carries more weight than spectacle ever could. This is the point the myth was always trying to reach. Not to lift you out of humanity, but to place you fully inside it without distortion. If the Book of Enoch feels like it closes quietly, that is deliberate. The narrative does not resolve into supremacy. It dissolves into restraint. The danger passes when fascination fades and behavior remains. That is the victory state the text protects. A life that carries capacity without announcing it, influence without demand, clarity without domination. At this stage, the idea of origin finally loses gravity. Who you come from no longer pulls at you because it no longer explains anything useful. Explanation belongs to initiation. You have crossed into maintenance. Maintenance is unglamorous, repetitive, and essential. Systems collapse when no one wants to maintain them. Lives fracture when those with capacity chase meaning instead of stability. This is where humility becomes everyday practice, not moral identity. You do not shrink or deny what you can perceive. You simply refuse to let perception outrun discipline. That refusal is what keeps environments survivable. Ancient texts encoded floods, falls, removals, and silences to make this point unforgettable. Power that cannot live inside the ordinary must be taken out of it. Notice how your instincts align here. You are less interested in proving depth and more interested in reducing damage. Less interested in being right and more interested in being clean. Clean means your presence does not leave debris, emotional, social, or psychological. People move on steadier than they arrive. Conversations settle instead of escalate. Outcomes simplify rather than sprawl. This is not accidental. It is the warning succeeding. The myth has now released you from its grip. That does not mean it was false. It means it completed its task. A map is not meant to be lived in. It is meant to get you safely where living can resume without constant instruction. When fascination ends and steadiness remains, the map folds itself away. There will still be those who want to reopen the story, to dramatize, elevate, or provoke collapse so the myth can perform again. Do not engage. A completed warning does not need defense. It simply functions by being unnecessary. When your conduct stays precise, myths lose oxygen and return to silence, where they belong. Here is the grounded truth that closes everything without flourish. You are not asked to be anything exceptional. You are asked to live in a way that makes exceptionality irrelevant. No lineage to claim. No symbol to embody. No boundary to cross theatrically. Just attention applied cleanly. Restraint practiced quietly. Ordinary days handled well.